Each FlexFuse primitive has what we refer to as its frame mesh. That's a simple mesh that guides the formation of the more complex procedural mesh. The frame's geometry is not part of the procedural mesh, but rather serves as a kind of cage, or in some cases a 2D profile, and we use that frame to transform, move, rotate, scale the procedural mesh, and also to help define its overall form. The frame never fully defines the form. At the very least, these procedurals all have some sort of edge looping that turns that frame into a more editable Catmull-Clark surface. But beyond that, quite often there are features to the geometry, to the procedural geometry, that aren't represented in the frame at all, like we see here with these cap variations available with this cylinder. And that's sort of the point here. While some features of this cylinder are very well controlled and represented with properties, with mesh op properties, and that's what we're controlling here with these channel handles, are the mesh op properties of some of the mesh ops that create this geometry. On the other hand, having the freedom of regular polygonal modeling allows us to quite arbitrarily modify the frame. For example, I could select the frame first here, and then select some edges of that frame geometry and make this cylinder more conical. And while there are limits to how radically you can change the frame and still have it make sense to the underlying procedural mesh, you have a great deal of freedom. And that, again, is the idea here. It would be impractical, really, to try to build in all the possible sort of cylindrical forms you might want to create. Whereas by being able to edit the frame, you can create really many forms, a wide variety of forms that all sort of fall into that general category of cylindrical sorts of geometries. And naturally, all of those various forms will still respond to the properties of the procedural. And there are more things we can do with frames and frame editing. I'll save that for another video. What I did want to mention here is that, of course, it becomes important to distinguish between the two and have the ability to show and hide the frame and the actual procedural mesh. And we have options for that to show and hide the procedural mesh, to show and hide the frame, to explicitly select the frame based on the selection of the procedural mesh or anything else, any other child of the frame. And note that when I selected it, also by default makes it visible. And furthermore, sometimes it is beneficial to have both the procedural and the frame visible, but not always easy to select the one that you want. In this case, it is easy because the frame doesn't correspond too precisely with the procedural mesh, so I can easily select one or the other. But there are cases where the frame can be obscured or just too similar to the procedural mesh, and selection can be kind of touchy. So we have the option to make only the frame geometry selectable. So no matter where I click in this general area, I'm going to get the frame if I get anything. Or make only the procedural mesh selectable, which means no matter where I click, I won't get the frame, I'll get the procedural. Or make them both selectable. And this is especially important when working with MeshFusion, because if you're wanting to fuse things, you're always wanting to fuse the procedural mesh, never the frame. So by simply making the frame not selectable, you can use all of Fusion's features, including drag and drop, easily without ever having to worry about mistakenly selecting or trying to fuse the frame.